I'd like to very much welcome Elaine Ho, who is joining us. Are you joining us from Hong Kong or?
Yes. My video is very funny. I will explain.
No, I like it. I like it.
I kind of like it also. I look like a Buto dancer.
Well, I might want to try something myself as well, but I'll leave this for you now. Yeah, I'm always amazed, dear Elaine, by your creativity. Elaine wanted to be a writer when she was growing up, was always encouraged by the people around her until she says that she had gone through a fateful failure at the age of 18 and was kind of moved to a foreign flavored writing, a foreign like elementary level English course, which also reshaped or this transition maybe shaped also or your what you want to do perhaps, or how you imagined what you want to do. But from what I see, it hasn't really limited anything really. Maybe it has opened so many interesting windows in your head. She is initiator of artist-run project Space Home Shop, which was based in Beijing between 2008 2013, and has like so many collaborations, including Display Distribute, which started in 2015, still going on, and it's a feral courier service, and it's linked to a feral courier service that is called Light Logistics. Among her collaborations as well, Dot Propaganda Department, which a collective that ran between 2017 2021, and Radio Slumber from 2021 with Amy Suo Wu. So today, Elaine is with us to speak about her work and this like mixed area, like mixed spaces between the public and the personal, and the artistic and the collaborative, and the collaborative and the personal, and all these like.
Okay, I like your video too, Elaine.
Thank you. There she's back.
Great. Yeah, my connection disconnects. Okay. So I'll just leave it to you, Elaine.
Okay. It's very fitting, actually, that the technological breakdown can introduce me, because it's actually, that I wanted to prepare this Zoom presentation in a specific way that I've tried out a few times before with other presentations. And I had a computer breakdown yesterday. And this is why now I'm working on a very, very old laptop that doesn't allow me to change the Zoom background in the way that I would have done normally. So it will be very unprepared, but I assume by the title of your workshop in general that this is acceptable. So please bear with me that it will be a little bit scattered, and I'm trying to share the screen. Do I just click on desktop?
Yes,
it can
something called if you want to share all your desktop, you share desktop, otherwise you just share the window you want to share.
Okay. I have to type a password. Just thank you very much for this.
Yes.
Can
now
you hear me?
See the whole of your desktop.
That's okay. You can. Okay. Can you hear me still?
Yes, and we can hear you.
And I will expose my brain via the inner workings of my laptop, my very old laptop, to you, because the presentation that I wanted to make was not possible. So it will end up being a lot of exploring through my computer and the internet and things. So just to show you, this is presentations that we've done in the past with the Zoom background. It's quite fun, actually, like playing a weather reporter or something like this. This is my collaborator at Display Distribute, one of my collaborators named Ming Lin. Nice. And this is, for a previous presentation. But yes, so on that regard, it is unprepared. And I also have a tendency to blabber a lot when I'm nervous during public speaking. So please all of you feel free to interrupt me with questions. And I think it really relates to this question of collaboration in general, because of the fact that collaboration is not something that I can speak about necessarily on my own. I feel like, especially with the authority of the speaker that is given in this kind of context, where there's a sort of hierarchy involved of the speaker, for me to speak about collaboration almost casts a kind of expertise or authority on it that I do not want to claim. And perhaps that's a reason why this will be the first time, and I have never really spoken about or across the variety of my work very often publicly. And to explain that a little bit, I have to say that, yes, as Ala mentioned in the introduction, I work in very, very different ways over the last 10, 15 years or so, in different configurations, for example, with different collectives and different ways of working, different formats, different media, so to speak. And so the aesthetics or the outputs that come out of that are extremely different, and they're not necessarily telling. Of course, there are interests that manifest in a particular work. For example, you make a book and there's a topic, there's content to that book that you addressed, but perhaps the core of my practice across all of these different varieties is about collaboration itself. But that's not something that manifests necessarily in the final product of a book, or, you know, in an installation and exhibition per se. And I think what that points to is the fact that, I mean, collaboration is almost like an unseen part of a process. And those processes are indeed what interests me most about my practice, or about practicing in general. So where do I start? So yes, about production processes. I think in preparation, actually, I did listen to this talk from Homi Bhabha that Ala had shared. I don't know if you all have seen it as well. And he mentions at one point about, I think what he's talking about very much is sort of the way that precarity is being used as a tool to embed within systems of governance or within infrastructures by leaders and by states to control the people, or to cast a certain sort of anxiety and uncertainty that eliminates agency from our ability to move things ourselves, to organize ourselves. And I agree very much with this. And I think probably going back then maybe to something that Madhu said, and I will say that I will speak a lot through these two previous talks, because that, in a way, also this way of working in a response-based manner is another way of talking about collaboration. But so Madhu, at one point, she was talking about, right now I lost my train of thought. What I wanted to say, though, is that I think that, of course, processes of capitalism are complicit in the same way that processes of governance that Bhabha speaks about are embedded as tools. And the way that he mentioned psychology at one point, which I found very interesting. So that relationship between psychology as a tool and which employs precarity in order to govern peoples. And I think that capitalism works in actually very much the same way. And of course, capitalism is not separate from governments. We all know that these things are extremely intertwined nowadays. But a lot of the work that I will show today does involve like these questions of like commercial processes, or the way that thinking about transaction and exchange. And this is also another aspect of thinking about collaboration. So to deconstruct then a process of production is to think about then also the way in which thought becomes a form. So that can happen as a production process when somebody has an idea to make a product, somebody or an artist has an idea to make a painting, a writer has an idea to make a book, and that thought at one point becomes engaged as a practice, and many different influences, many different material processes occur to create a final outcome. And that entire trajectory, including all of the people that we work with nowadays, because very often nowadays our production process are collaborative, whether we're talking about companies or we're talking about art collectives or governments, that trajectory itself is really what my interest is about. And for me, what that really says, or what that talks about almost in a Marxist sense, is like, how do we produce, how are we making things, which tells very much about how we are living together, and how can we live together. So collaboration, I mean, and maybe I use it in a very sort of blurry manner, because I guess maybe there's a certain sort of utopian ideal that we would like to think about, and especially in terms of artist collectives. It sounds, you know, extremely utopian, the idea of working together and or making a collective, but I think of it in a very, very broad sense in terms of, as I said, the deconstruction of those processes from thought to form, or between theory and practice. And so this can include, I mean, we can even get to certain levels, like, for example, things that maybe Donna Haraway, or like there's a writer, a very nice writer named Anna Ching, who wrote this amazing book called The Mushroom at the End of the World. I don't know if some of you know it. And she talks about the sort of interspecies collaboration from an ethnographic research about the collection of the Matsutake mushroom. And the idea of how this mushroom came to being was actually out of sort of human intervention into nature. And that produced this possibility for mushroom that, because it can only be harvested in a very special way, it cannot be farmed. The Matsutake mushroom ends up becoming a sort of detritus of human intervention on Earth that is collected by very often sort of minority figures. For example, there's a huge market for matsutake collecting that is performed mostly by sort of illegal immigrants or minority groups that have moved from Southeast Asia to the United States, where a lot of it is grown in Northwest United States. And that market then gets retransported back to Japan very often, because this is where that mushroom is most enjoyed, I suppose. And there's a huge market. It's a very, very expensive mushroom. But this is a very long sort of divergence. But that idea of that kind of interspecies collaboration, I think, is also extremely fascinating in a sense to talk about. These are things that are influencing us, or we are influencing also other species or ways of being in the world, that I think if we can say by way of this production process, we can be more attentive to, it would influence then, of course, then how we act in the world, or how we produce things, and how we work together, how we behave with one another. So this is like the kind of general, larger, more sort of, I don't know, philosophical thought related to all of this. But let me start with, now I've been showing you a very boring screen for quite a long time now. So I will show you some more boring pictures. This is actually, I start with a very inadvertent collaboration. Wait, oh no, because this thing is blocking it, I cannot see the window. Hold on a second. Can I close this little, oh, I see, I go like this. So this is actually just a blog. It's and it's funny because this is probably one of the longest term outputs, I should say, that has kind of followed me along despite all of the changes in my practice, or despite having moved to different cities in the world. this blog has been around since 2005, so it's very old-fashioned in a way. And it is a collaboration of contributors. I think there are about 8 or 9 of us. And it started in 2005. I studied, because I studied in the Netherlands. And after that, I moved to Beijing. And I think it really, this was 2005. You have to remember it. If there are some of you who are a bit older, you will know that around that time was, I guess, probably the height of blogs. And also photo blogging was something that we were all quite interested in as a way to sort of like leave things. You know, the internet at this time was still a very optimistic place for kind of, you know, being able to express a certain sort of freedom of expression that I think is you have to say is a bit more jaded nowadays with the sort of proprietariness of the internet. But at that time, it was a really beautiful place for us to exchange, especially because there were a lot of us that were then spread out in many different places in the world. And so it became a sort of a place for us to make an exchange with one another via images and text and whatnot. And I say this is an inadvertent collaboration because the texts that are here are things that don't necessarily, it's almost diaristic in a certain sense. So there are things that are written here that don't necessarily fit in other places. And the way that I contribute very often is almost like a diary, the things that I write on here. And so at one point, so this image is from one of the posts. It's probably a bit too small for you to read, but it's okay. I will play an audio for you in a moment. This text, I will just preface it to say that it started out simply as something that I wrote in reaction to a conflation of this different events that were happening in the year 2019. So if some of you are familiar, 2019 was the time of the breakout in the summer of a very massive series of protests in Hong Kong. And I won't explain, it's a very complicated story. If you want to know the history or the reason why all of this has happened, you can ask, but but otherwise it's very complicated. But anyhow, I assume you can to simplify very much, it has to do, of course, with the long running sort of fear of what will happen to Hong Kong because of, since the handover back to China, there has been an increasing limitation of certain freedoms and change of sort of the government, also modes of precarity we can talk about again. And those protests were in a way, I mean, yeah, actually in a way an extremely hopeful time, but also in terms of that urgency of the situation. It, of course, overtook all of our everyday lives. And it put, for me, a lot in question about my own practice. Like that particularity of socio-political urgency makes you question, or it casts a certain shadow on the meaning of what we are doing as artists. And I would guess that a lot of you have perhaps considered that at different forms in the way that you make your work, whether how you deal with the politics, or is it possible to simply, you know, do something very personal. And these are not separate again, but how they get manifest can be questioned at every turn, including like how you are able to show or not, which institutions you are working with. All of those things are complicit. So anyhow, I wrote a text that kind of addressed, it's very sort of emotional and a little bit, anyhow, I wrote this text as a sort of reflection of that, but also something else that happened at the same time was a friend of mine in China. And I have to say, because I lived in China before I moved back to Hong Kong, I lived in China for very many years. So I do actually have quite a lot of attachments to mainland that many other Hong Kongers don't have. And at that time, because of the protests and being quite involved, I was not returning to China as often as I was in the past. And a friend of mine, a very young artist, became pregnant. and her boyfriend left her. Of course, there was a big series of social dramas in Guangzhou, the city that she was living in at the time. And this, of course, is a very interpersonal, intimate matter. And yet we all know that there's a sociopolitics involved with that, with this potential, gender roles, and the possibility of being a single mother in China is a very, very difficult issue, because the system there, the sort of ID registration system there makes it very, very difficult for a child to get the ID that would allow them to attend school if you're not married. So all of those things were embedded, were kind of conflating emotionally and politically and everything, and that resulted in this text that talks about these different issues. And I ended up just kind of, I'm not even sure anymore now if he invited me to do this or if I just did it, but I ended up recording myself reading this text, and I sent it to a friend of mine in Singapore, who, because we had also been having conversation, he was also kind of going through a similar period. His name is Yutong Lai. I think Allah, I don't know if you know him. He was actually also present in when we were presenting at this symposium in Singapore. And I think he was also dealing with a lot of similar issues as a young artist, in terms of finding ways to make meaning via his practice. And as a visual artist, he ended up kind of starting to dabble in music. And I sent him this audio recording, and he ended up, it ended up accidentally playing while he was recording himself. And so then my voice ended up becoming part of this song that he made. And he ended up putting an album on Bandcamp, which is called, so his band or his group music name is called The Cosmologists. And you can find, I can share the link with you later or now. Should have put it in the chat if you want to hear. So that is one level of this inadvertent collaboration. And then secondly, because this text also deals with my friend Yangzi in Guangzhou, I ended up sending it to her. And because she doesn't actually speak English, the text is in English, she asked a friend to translate it into Chinese. And during the process of him listening to this recording and translating it, I think he also felt compelled in a certain sense to respond. So he himself made a recording that responded to what I wrote, and she ended up mixing these two together. And I didn't know this at the time until in the end I saw that she used this recording as part of a film that she made. So I'm going to play a little excerpt for you now, just to give myself a break.
Why are we not running away?
Could you hear that? Okay.
Why are we not running away? Why do we spend so much time together, only to prepare for our solitude?
But the same collapses in upon itself. It's just so hard to stay fiery. These weekends going out there, around and behind and on the margins of front, the smell. These acculturations that kill me. Weekend, Monday to Friday. It had dawned upon me after this summer of discontent that the problem right now is that all that practice that I had built a practice upon didn't make sense anymore. Like I used to dislike contractions, and now they're here all over the place. Sense changes. Is she more awake now that she's pregnant and he's gone off to the Philippines? Where is that collusion between all those baby details we once found God in and baby mama, this big shit of a mess we're in now?
The ultimate form of which is love and death. This is our wedding day. So why are we thinking such a lot? Why are we worrying? Why do we worry who we are? Why do we worry about how to explain? Why do we worry if we should explain? Why this win? And why we want to win? Why the place? Why the song? Why the life? Why our lives? But why not?
The sounds that you heard in the end are actually because, as I think I said it already now, she used this as in a film that she made.
I still don't think it is the good time.
Sorry. And I will send the link for you to watch it later if you like. And so what's interesting, I think, about this is this was all, as you can see now in big print, there, inadvertent collaboration. And there's also something quite interesting, I think, about that a term that Madhu used in her talk. She talked about curating as a compulsion, I think, or we can talk about artistic practice in general as a kind of compulsion, in the sense that sometimes there are things that just have to happen, things that come out of you or things that, and for me, because this was all very spontaneous and it happened one-to-one over very different layers with people who don't even necessarily know one another, right? The musician from Singapore doesn't know the friends in Guangzhou, and these things happened, some things happened without my knowing, but it became somehow, then you could call it a work in these different layers. And that I found very, very beautiful in a sense, despite, all of the sort of discontent and feeling of being lost that sort of started this piece of text, you could say. So this is just one small example, and I actually recently talked about this because I gave a presentation a couple of weeks ago talking about my sound practice, and this I found very, very, very funny because I don't consider myself a sound artist. I don't consider myself a sound artist at all. And yet, of course, sound I have worked with sound quite often over the years. So this is a SoundCloud account, yes, that became in a way, for me, a way to cheat a little bit because, as I said, working with different collectives, those things don't necessarily seem appropriate to all put on my individual website. And because I like working with sound a lot, and it's not something that necessarily manifests or finds its way into exhibition context so easily, except, for example, as the sound accompanying a video or sound accompanying installation. I wouldn't say I have the bravery, or I'm not a sound artist in the direct sense that I would know necessarily how to put that into that context. And so while I've done a lot of recordings, I've been interested in working with sound very often, or done podcasts, as I said, I'm not a sound artist, but the SoundCloud it was just a fun way to archive some of these things that had been happening over the years, I would say, and to work things across. And why I find this interesting or relevant to bring up in this context is because it works on the same level to me as the way that we're talking about collaboration, in the sense that it actually is an unseen as a medium. It's not, we don't say, you say that you're a sound artist, but yes, saying that you're a sound artist does not address the topics. The real concern is the topics that you're working with, the concepts you're working with. So saying that you're a sound artist doesn't necessarily say so much. If I say I'm a collaborative artist, it also doesn't mean anything, right? But somehow, if we work across these things by way of a SoundCloud website, or by way of me trying to jump across these different practices tonight, then maybe we get to something. But that sort of way of having to talk around or address what is aside from the content, I actually find is very tricky, because we're sort of like, how do you say, sort of like complicit within the problematics of language itself. But that again is something of strong interest, and that I will get into in a little while with the publishing projects. But now I'll go back, and this I've talked about quite a lot. Allah has seen me talk about this several times, but I won't talk about it too much. This is the artist-run project space that I was involved with some others from 2008 to 2013 in Beijing. And why this is important for me is because you could probably say this was after I had finished school in the Netherlands and moved here. You could say it was a beginning in a way of my artistic practice, which also didn't have a specific form. And this space, which I didn't realize at the time, sort of set the groundwork for a lot of these interests in thinking about what is an open platform, like what can an open space be, and who gathers there. So again, this question of like, who is the public that we are addressing, who is we, so to speak, and what can we do together? And this, the specific context of this situation has to do with two aspects, one being the storefront space, which you see, there are two different ones here because we moved at one point, but both of them are storefront spaces. But it's a home and a shop. So the character you see here, it means house. And I was living in this store. And so that being the first sort of play that we were making, one between this architecture of a commercial space, but also the sort of domesticity of just living your life in your home, and like what that wanted to sort of reflect was also a very strong interest in specific public and private dynamics that are really quite interesting in the city of Beijing, where those both legally in terms of like what is public and what is private space, but also in terms of culture, like what different norms there are, or like, because those things are quite specific in Beijing. I think the idea to conflate the house, I mean, you probably see this very often in Palestine as well, where like people live in their shops, and that kind of dynamic that happens is something I think that we wanted to question as a socio-political space, like what it's in a neighborhood, so to speak. The neighbor is also, if you're a shop owner who lives in your shop, your customer is also your neighbor, and this person also becomes your friend. And those juxtapositions of these different subjectivities and where they blur together, or where one can become the other, like perhaps a stranger that passes by the shop ends up becoming a customer, ends up becoming a friend, ends up becoming a neighbor, or ends up becoming your partner and your collaborator. All of those sort of movements from one role to the next, I think are also the core question of what collaboration can be, because it's not simply about like we stay together, but it's about how we move one another, how we change our roles and change one another, I would say. So that space then became this juxtaposition of working with, we can call them our friends, we can call them other people living in the neighborhood. And it was very much defined by that kind of dynamic of Beijing at this time. Started before the Olympics. So you have to imagine that Beijing before the Olympics was kind of this entrance of China onto the world stage. And there was a lot of pride of the city sort of becoming recognized by the world. And this went alongside with a huge urban development, of course, in preparation for the Olympics. But at the same time that you see Beijing becoming this sort of cosmopolitan city that it is today, you see that in this old city center where our space was located, there was still very much a very strong sort of almost like village neighborhood kind of dynamic. So there's both, in the sense of there's a certain sort of like cohesion of this idea of like the neighborhood shop and the local population of who lives on that block, at the same time that you have this sort of like cosmopolitan awakening and the entire sort of urban change that Beijing was becoming at this time. So we were documenting a lot of this by way of sort of various artistic forms of documentation, recordings. We were making our own publications, doing small events and reading groups, and that space then sort of existed as, I would say, 5 years in 2 different spaces. And the publishing practice became something that we just attempted without having had experience with it before, but it became a very crucial part of the practice because it was like a second layer where these very small scale events, because it's a very small space that we're talking about, with not very many participants, could have a second layer for reflection via text and via image in printed form. And then those books, the idea, of course, with any publishers, you wish after you produce the book for it to be published and shared with other people who, especially in the case of documentation, were not at the original event, so to speak. And so this is the beginning, I would say, of my interest in publishing. And then to talk about, I mean, collaboration, we can also even mention like our enemies, for example, our enemies as being influential collaborators in terms of defining how we work and do not work. And it is actually the case with the publishing practice that I found the biggest hiccup that I had to encounter as a publisher was not the actual making of the book, but yes, how to share it and how to get it out there. So to speak specifically about the distribution of the books. And so this is how the Light Logistics project came about later. But I will introduce, now I'm going to jump again. I will introduce Display Distribute first so that you understand the background of this. So after I left Beijing, I came back to Hong Kong, and this is another storefront space. So again, I think this interest in sort of frameworks for economy being a sort of also space for encounter is something quite important to me. And Hong Kong being, of course, like the sort of economic capital that it is, this storefront is quite interesting because it's a pop-up shop. They're actually empty storefront spaces all over the city in Hong Kong. Let me show you their website. So they have a website, this company called Wingda. And you can look at all these spaces they have all over the city. That's the map. Oops. And basically you can call them, you see the phone number there, and you say, I want this space on this day, is it available? And if it's available, you simply transfer money to them, and then you go there. It's not even locked because they're just empty, concrete blocks like this one. And you enter, and then you bring your own stuff and make your shop for the day. You rent it by the day. And my collaborator Ming that started this Display Distribute, actually, she began this project really as a documentation of this phenomenon. And it has a lot, of course, to do with that specificity of Hong Kong being a sort of export capital and a place for a lot of this sort of leakage of surplus goods from China to end up. So most of the goods that end up being sold in these kind of like pop-up shops are things that won't make it to the global market because they're not good enough, or they're extra stock or things like this. And so, individual traders will bring things over from cheap goods from China and sell them in Hong Kong. And it is from this space and this kind of I would say like a ethnographic documentation of what was going on with this that sort of incited our interest in these sort of movements that are happening across the Hong Kong and China border. And that became the basis for Display Distribute. And so it made sense then, in a way, then going back to logistics, for us to think about then how to combine our interest in publishing with this consideration of like the movement of the books themselves. So the Light Logistics project is basically a, it's fashioned in almost kind of like a mock DHL sort of courier service sort of way. So we have a website that documents, here we go. So we have this website that documents all of these travels of the books that we sell. So some of these are our own books, but we're also working with publishers from all over Asia and Southeast Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, which also has the sort of interest in assembling sort of economies of thought or kind of alignments in terms of independent publishing, but also in terms of sort of like de-hegemonize, how do you say it? De-hegemonizing or anti-hegemonial practices via printed form and looking at different independent collectives working in these different parts of the world. So we call it the distro. We sell these books, and what happens then when somebody orders a book is that they have to wait, because we don't use postal services as a lot of other booksellers do. And I mean, what that really is, of course, is basically an addition of cost to the buyer, which we hope not to do, because a lot of the publishers that we're working with are really not, I mean, one is the question of like how the publisher themselves distributes their books, but one is also, is it fair to keep adding many costs on? We wanted to keep the books as low cost as possible, and this interest in logistics and sort of deconstructing that process of this book production process led us to say, like, let us do it in a very inefficient way by making our books travel only by existing travel. You could also call it a slightly more sort of environmentally friendly sort of project. So basically it relies on someone, if for example, someone in Ramallah would order a book from us, then they would have to wait until we find somebody from Hong Kong to get to Ramallah, or from Hong Kong to Amman, and Amman to Ramallah, something like this. So sometimes these things happen very fast by chance, and sometimes very slowly. I think the longest route that we've had so far has taken, I think, 2 years. And this, as you can imagine, has been doubly slowed down, triply slowed down, almost put to a stop because of since the pandemic era. So I have to admit that we have cheated a little bit on occasion as a way to support people to stay at home to read when they can. And I'm just going to show you this video is also just some screen grabs from the website. But I think where we deviate, as I said, from the sort of DHL model is, of course, one, the question of inefficiency, but two, about the way of logging these routes. So those pictures that you just saw now, I'll go back there again. They are from a courier who brought books from Hong Kong into China, and she had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And because of that quarantine, she asked that the books not be wrapped so that she could read them when she was in quarantine. So these kind of like random exceptions to that production process happen because of the way the system is set up, and this allowing for the log to log this kind of inadvertent encounters between a courier and their goods, or between the courier and the receiver of the book, All of those things are similarly to what I talked about with Home Shop and this displacement of subjectivities, has a similar interest in sort of like opening up the spaces for discourse within that network. And what I mean by that, like, it's one-to-one. And Madhu also spoke about the one-to-one being a sort of like her vision or her idea or understanding of what pedagogy is like a sort of, how does she describe it? She said it is a kind of reciprocal exchange that adds something. And that I think was quite eye-opening for me, because I also don't necessarily think of pedagogy in that way, but I do believe that actually this project and the way that it networks and it emphasizes this one-to-one, meaning we find a courier to go and have a random meeting with a stranger. And very often these meetings among strangers end up being conversations, or end up being, you know, sharing or having a coffee together, or maybe the publisher ends up bringing the book as a courier themselves and therefore gets to meet the reader of their book. And all of those kind of sort of things that deviate from the protocol of a normal logistical enterprise are the things which interest us the most. So again, it's about the things that happen on the side, really. And while we call it a logistical courier service, is actually all of these things that deviate from the straight line of logistics that make this project sort of interesting for us. Yes. Did I want to say anything else about this? If anybody has any question, feel free to stop me. Did I have more photos? Oh, so just as one example, because it relates. This is one route, HQL332, and this one also took quite a long time. The route started in Hong Kong, and I mean, it took a long time. Very funnily, it was supposed to go to Utrecht, and it took a long time just in the short distance between Rotterdam and Utrecht. So this courier, the woman with no hair on the lower right-hand corner, she's the courier. And she brought the book from Hong Kong to Rotterdam, but she's very busy. And so she never could manage to find the time to bring the book from Rotterdam to Utrecht, which is a very short distance in the Netherlands, and of course, a very small country. So it ended up taking also, I think, over 1 year. And this is the location of the final meeting spot, because the receiver of the book ended up herself going to Rotterdam. And so they met in Rotterdam at one point. And this is on a stairwell of the Piet Zwart Academy, it's an art school. I think it's just an outdoor stairwell where students gather just to smoke cigarettes or something. This is the receiver getting the book. And as part of the documentation of this route, you see there's this banner that's hanging from that stairwell. And this I found quite fascinating, that because it led me also to learn more about this story, which was very fascinating, I find, in the context of the Netherlands, because you don't hear of these kinds of censorship necessarily happening in the West so often, but there was a big controversy behind this banner that was hung. I can show you the link for it. Where is it? Very difficult to manage here. Oh, here. So this banner was censored by the university and forced to pull down. And so you can read more about this if you're interested. I'll also share this in the chat. And not only this banner, but as a protest of that banner being censored, they put this banner up, which of course you all know about. But I didn't know actually about this watermelon metaphor, symbolism at the time. And so it is via this route that I also gained something, but I think it was quite interesting then also that this story particular to this university in the Netherlands then also gets distributed. So it's this idea or this story that gets distributed along with those books back and forth. It's not only from to a reader, but it's back to all of us by way of this project. Yeah. So I'm going to, do I still have time? Are we okay? Are we okay on time?
Yes, we're okay because I don't see any questions coming. So
okay, okay. So I will talk then lastly about something very immediately that is going on now. This is, and this relates actually to the censorship that I just talked about, but this is an exhibition that Display Distribute was invited to curate in Guangzhou, or co-curate a section of in Guangzhou, and it actually opens tomorrow. Of course, because of the border restrictions, I was not able to go. So it's been quite a difficult process, I would say, having to try to work on all of this over the distance. But I wanted to mention it also because it relates to the publishing practices. So the initial premise of this exhibition was to address artistic practices from Southeast Asia. And this for me also, this sort of geographical specificity as a premise to curate an exhibition is already quite questionable for me. And not only next to that, this idea of Southeast Asia was specifically stated by the institution as not being allowed to include Hong Kong or Taiwan. And this is, of course, for political reasons. And you could say, okay, this sounds already quite ridiculous. Why would you participate in this exhibition? But this is the tricky part, right? Where the personal and the politics, and also I have to say again, like the naivety for the idea of what we can do, still working within the system. I think that a lot of our practices and our ways of working, we talk about the semi-autonomous zine as a concept that Display Distribute works with. And that idea of semi-autonomy points to this fact that yes, we know that we cannot be, outside of the system anymore. And therefore, it's about what we can do sort of within that. How do you maneuver through the cracks in the system? This is what parallel traders, this is what the smugglers do. And this is what I think a lot of us as sort of independent practitioners are trying to do with the way that we work. And so for this exhibition, despite this sort of difficulties, it's a state institution because the institution is an art academy in Guangzhou, is the art university. The curator who invited me to curate this section, she's a good friend of mine. And I mean, if that's the most simple sort of excuse I can make, I have to actually think about Allah a lot, I remember one time you mentioned to me about how you decided that you didn't want to be afraid to approach the people that you admire, right? About your invitation to this publisher for the conference that we participated in before. And I think that idea of camaraderie in terms of how we work professionally is not something that we can ignore. And it's also the blurry line between like how we live and how we work. And if we cannot like build upon those camaraderies, then I think, yeah, we have no hope, right? But it's about that possibility of like where those publics can open up further. So with this curator being a good friend of mine, we decided to take a chance. And also I think we were kind of tempted to challenge a little bit this sort of like ridiculous protocols, or like test the boundaries of what we could play with in terms of this exhibition. So actually, of the 5 collectives that I have invited to participate in this exhibition, one is actually a Taiwanese-based group. But the very irony of the thing is that they then, and our group also, we had to change our bio to not say that we are from Hong Kong. We say that we're from the Pearl River Delta, which is a sort of more nebulous region in South China. And the group from Taiwan that we invited have changed their name in this instance to be called the Overseas Chinese Students Collective, which is quite funny. But I think, you know, as that watermelon banner tells you, you know, I mean, there are ways that we have to play with language in order to, and this is why translation is such an interesting process, no? Ways that we have to make these attempts to not only change the words, but by changing the words, therefore we change the way that we think, right? So the other 4 groups that I invited, one, there are 2 from Yogyakarta, one called New Pessimism, one called Indie Scene Partai. And then I wanted to talk about the work, one called Buku Jalanan from Kuala Lumpur. And then I wanted to talk briefly about the work from the group from Bangkok. But yeah. So my funny face, as you see it now, the way it looks, the reason why it looks like that is because I am using the screen background, but my old computer doesn't allow this, you know, background effect. But this is the image that should be behind my head. And this is part of their work, which is an image that was made just for a video monitor. It doesn't, and it looks almost like, you know, these kind of CAPTCHA things that you have to fill in on the internet sometimes, you know, to prove that you're a human. But it says, can I say it though? And this is also, you know, like an interesting way that I think they have chosen to poke a little bit at the problematics of our entire process of making this exhibition, because they have also been censored. And I want to talk a little bit about their project and why. So they are working, they're a young group of mostly translators actually, from Thailand, and their project also deals with the political unrest that was happening in Thailand from 2020, I believe. And this, of course, holds a lot of resonance personally for me, because the protests in Thailand also, there was a lot of conversation going back and forth, because there were so many relations between what was happening in Thailand and what was happening in Hong Kong. And this manifested not only in terms of, you know, political exchanges among the protesters, but also even in terms of tactics and, you know, techniques that were being transferred by, you know, things that were happening on the ground in Hong Kong were also then being used in Thailand. And their translation project that they do for our exhibition in Guangzhou comprises of letters that they have collected from a lot of student protesters that were arrested during this time. And these letters, a lot of them are written by the protesters to the public, but they were kind of leaked out either by lawyers or by their relatives and then put up very often on Facebook. I show you, these are some excerpts that they have selected, and they translated them into English. And then we also engaged in a process of translating them into Chinese. And so, which I always find fascinating is all these editing. This is again, you know, documentation of the process. You see through this kind of track changes function and all of these things that are happening in the process. And so if you look at, let me show you all of this, you'll see this. Can you see where I highlighted on the screen? So this 3 characters with the dots around them. These are words that are being censored. And this was a midway point, kind of trying to find a solution, because at one point it was very obvious that this work would not be able to be shown in its straightforward context in China, because the situation is getting more and more severe. And this being a state institution, it's even more strict. And so we thought, okay, let's see what we can do in order to still be able to show the full work. But if we have to censor some words, what words would they be? And that game of like trying to understand or trying to determine what is sensitive is also very fascinating, because I mean, this particular words are almost like, you know, they're the act of reading. I always consider a one-to-one process. It's like a dialogue between a writer and you as you are reading, but to try to analyze what a government would see from a text is such a it's almost it's a very disturbing game. And you know, and I felt very troubled actually working on this and having to try to make guesses of what words we would not be able to show. And ironically, I mean, theirs is not the only work that has been censored in this exhibition. I have to say, it makes me very upset. This is probably why I have to share it with you all to release my anger. But this is a work from another group, the Buku Jalanan from Kuala Lumpur. And this is a poster of theirs that has been translated from Malay to English and Chinese. And the words here in this instance, which I found also very interesting to talk about, that have been censored are the water droplets are covering the word freedom, and the star is covering I guess it translates as ism, like in the word activism, the ism. And so this is very interesting. So it also happened in several other instances. Like, for example, the word for feminism in Chinese is basically like womanism, basically the word for woman, and then adding the ism becomes feminism. And so, yeah, the ism in that case also is not allowed. So anything that points to sort of an ideology is not allowed. And it becomes then here simply sort of active instead of activism. And there's another example. Let me look for the photo for you. This one, I was also quite surprised by. The word that has been censored here is religious center. So these are also, I really have to say, this was also very much shocking for me, because it did not used to be so bad when I lived in China in the past. This is really getting quite severe, the situation. But back to Nam Kun's work. Nam Kun is a group from Bangkok. Oh, I will share their website with you as well in a second. So this character here, was the idea of Nam Kun themselves for how we're going to censor their work. So we look for the keywords. What are sensitive words that we're not allowed to say? And I can tell you some of the things, like words like prison, words like police, anything that points to the fact that this is actually, all of this is relating to the protests in Thailand, are not allowed. And these three characters they used as a sort of symbol of what's being censored is quite funny. They have a sense of humor. It's actually a sound, shiu shiu shiu, which is the sound of breathing, which is supposed to mock, for example, the sound of a ghost, as if a ghost is behind you, breathing, behind your neck. So that was a midpoint attempt to kind of find a way to show their work. But as you can see from this example here, there's so much shiu 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 that the organizers of the exhibition, they also said, well, it's also too obvious, that this painting in black, what cannot be said, points even more loudly to what cannot be said. And so this also we could not come to a compromise about it, basically. And so in the end, unfortunately, we've decided to take all of the Chinese out of the show, and for Nam Kun's work, it will only be the Thai and the English, but they will release the full versions on their website. So that again is ways that we have to deal with the situation. This is their website, if you want to take a look. And I actually forgot to mention about this exhibition, another very, very, very quite amusing. I mean, all of this is so absurd. It goes to the level of absurdity. Is that in the beginning, this exhibition also about the halfway point, because basically the way that the censorship process works in China is that if an exhibition is declared, then there's of course a certain authority, a bureau, that then has to send this kind of surveillance to come and check on the work and approve everything. And of course, this being a state institution, this process would have to go through, and it was already long ago, at least a month or two ago, that the authorities already said that this exhibition was not allowed. The whole exhibition was not allowed. And but the museum also really, of course, I think they have also invested a lot in trying to put it together. They wanted to go forward with it. And the museum also finds itself in this difficult place in between the state and their own interest in artistic production, and yet they are also a bureaucratic institution. So what they did in order to be able to make this exhibition happen was say, well, we don't call it an exhibition, and therefore is not under the category which would require it to have to be put under that kind of checking and surveillance. So they changed it to call it a display of research. So it's not an exhibition anymore, it's a display of research. And this is why this exhibition can happen from tomorrow. But again, they being a very bureaucratic institution, the self-censorship is extreme. So they are under a lot of pressure also to not take it too far. And therefore, they are censoring works themselves as the sort of middle ground institution between the state authority and the students, which they should be serving within the institution. And they censor a lot of the work. So this is why there are still all of these things being taken out and changed. And we shall see. I also don't know even now yet what the final outcome will be. But I thought I would share that with you all. So I think, yes, I think that's all the work that I wanted to show. If you have any questions, it's very, very scattered. I apologize.
No, it's amazing. And I think by this act of sharing, you've already exhibited the works into a certain point, let's say. I see there's a question from Jude. Thank you very much, Elaine. This was really amazing. And okay, we have a question from Jude.
Yes. Thank you, Elaine. I reiterate what Ala said. This was really, really amazing. I was actually very excited while also watching the talk that Ala had shared with us before the session. I have a very specific question actually that relates to what you said about thinking of how we produce and how we make things, and referencing, for example, a Marxist understanding of that. So the question for me, which I encounter a lot nowadays, is how do we navigate that, particularly when it comes to the issue of funding, when we engage with independent practices and DIY modes of producing and making? How do we engage in that or with that without replicating the precarity of unpaid labor, for example? And yeah. So that was my question. And particularly like when we're talking about contexts that are like outside institutions, outside biennales, all of that, like, yeah.
I mean, for sure, there is no singular solution to all of these things. I think that, and Ala, probably with your interest in maneuvering, I think we all know that we have to sort of negotiate these at every instance. And we are all, as artists, completely complicit within like the fact that we need, you know, the funding of institutions sometimes to produce work. I think that's very rare nowadays. Well, I wouldn't say that rare, but I think there's a more and more of us who do not have the budgets to produce work. And if you work in a response-based way, that you produce work based upon the sort of context in which you are offered, and you respond to that. And that not only includes, of course, site specificity, but it's also like economic specificity, right? And I mean, the sort of politicizing of the art world in the last 10 years or so, I would say, it's more and more often that you see artists who do more homework in terms of, for example, like looking in to see who's funding the boards of these institutions that they're working with. And it's funny, I just recently had a conversation with Ming, one of the collaborators from Display Distribute, and she's based in New York, and she was, you know, doing exactly that, this kind of homework in terms of different institutions. And you find actually sometimes that a private institution that you want to work with, or a public institution that you want to work with, if you dig into it, actually the board members at the top, they're all the same people as well. So I mean, money is going to be dirty no matter what, but we all need it to a certain degree. And this is not to say that we can't care about it, but I think we have to make decisions at certain points. And me working with this Guangzhou Museum and this institution also was an attempt, you know. And it makes me very much question the possibility to work with that within that situation in the future. And sometimes, yes, then you make those mistakes, or you learn in a better way how to do it differently, or how to also say no when you have to. You know, I think there's different scales with which we can say things. Sometimes you need a bigger space, you need more money to say something, and sometimes you don't. And so I think as an artist, you have to consider the scale of what it is that you want to say. And the scale of the output should also sort of like be relative to the scale of what it is that you're saying. I mean, I think with the Light Logistics project, I think, of course, the socio-political interests that we have are very big, but because this idea of the one-to-one encounter, or this idea of like, how can there be a deeper dialogue and discourse between the publishers and the readers, those are all based on sort of intimate exchanges. And therefore, we maintain it actually in this very slow and one-to-one manner. And it doesn't require a lot of money, and we don't make money from it, but it's able to sort of like to persist, sort of sustain itself, you know. And if we get the possibility of an exhibition, then something else can come out of that. There's a reason why we don't produce many books actually as Display Distribute, because we don't have the money to do so. But at least we can work with the logistics project as a way to continue that. And then if there are other projects that allow that publishing to happen, then we try when we can, and we have done on occasion.
I actually like, because like now you mentioned also the word slowness. I remember in the talk you said something about this mode of like dealing with or doing logistics as turning this of value that is connected with like capitalist relations, and that is always based on speed and acceleration and all of that. So yeah, I think this like idea of also exchanges and transactions, or an engagement or like an approach to distribution and to logistics that emphasizes slowness over speed is also interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think the Homi Bhabha also mentioned in his talk about the time of governments. I think this was something that he said, and how power is now sort of made manifest as short performances. They're always like this, and this is a sort of like masculinity he's talking about in these sort of right populist leaders, that it happens in this sort of like masculine bursts of speed and that short burst performance of power. And I found the idea of the way you consider time in a gendered sense very interesting, because Maya Deren, the sort of experimental film director, she's talked about sort of a kind of woman's time, which I always found also like a very interesting concept. She talks about woman's time, of course, related to the concept of the womb and the idea of knowing that you have to wait for this time of bearing a child, or that possibility of thinking of what this child will become. That being a woman's time is much more slow, yes, and it's a different way of course, always relating to the other, if that other is your child or any other with the O, big O. But those, I think that way of breaking down time, I think is something, or considering a feminist perspective, is also something very, very much I'm interested in, and probably is definitely embedded in this project. Like, can we consider sort of a slow feminist way of like production processes? And yeah, I think that you can go into a whole other tangent there, thinking about ideas of like, you know, female labor, domestic work, the time of domestic work, and the money that is not associated with that. All of those things are related.
Thank you.
Thank you. The talk that Jude is referring to is basically what I shared with the workshop participants is your presentation in Abu Dhabi. That's what.
Okay.
Yeah. I like this. Okay, I see there's a question. Just one moment. How do you see? Can you tell us? That's a question from Iman Sharabati. How can you tell us? How do you see the performative dimensions in the publishing initiative that you've in display, distribute, or in the publishing initiative that you've mentioned, and how aware is the artist slash publisher slash writer, how like aware this character is of these dimensions, of these performative dimensions, and how they would be affecting and affected by what the initiative is initially trying to do, is basically invent or produce alternatives to the published material, right? To things that are being published already. I don't know if you understand the question. I can try to say it again. How do you see the performative aspects or dimensions of this publishing initiative? How much the people who are involved in this process are aware of this performativity, if there's any, and would this performativity affect the type of content that is being produced? Otherwise, Iman should come here and say what she means on this question.
I think I understand. I mean, I will.
I would love to, but I have a very bad connection. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I will answer something, and you can tell me if I'm answering, addressing your question in the how you mean or not. But yeah, let's talk about performativity through Instagram. It's like the most performative play of social media, right? Ever. So for sure it is involved. I think, I mean, there are so many of these kind of pictures, you know, that, I mean, it's very banal, and this, like, you know, people looking happy with their with packages, this kind of things, or like this one. I actually always found this very funny because it looks like they're on a date. So yeah, I think that aspect is there, and actually when I get these photos from the participants, these are actually the ones that I find the most boring. I don't really like them that much, but of course seeing them together like this is kind of funny. But I think some of the people who do this, who participate, they're not necessarily interested in this as an art project, or don't necessarily even understand the artistic sort of concerns or the aesthetic concerns, and that's okay actually, because sometimes they just want to help. They just, because they happen to be traveling from, you know, A to B, and they want to help, and that is perfectly fine. And so if they give us this is okay. And playing into that performativity, and they will be asked if they will be put on Instagram, so they know there's this public aspect of it. And if that provides like a weird sort of advertisement, I hope at least that it would encourage people to look at the books. That's the main concern, really. But I don't necessarily, I mean, if that performativity, does it negatively detriment the project? I mean, in the way that social media does in general, right? Like if this is a participation in the spectacle, then yes, we are guilty a little bit for sure. But I'm not necessarily
guilty of what? Of participating in the spectacle?
Yes.
Okay.
But I'm saying that
Nice to think about
that's something that we are quite, a lot of us are, you know, if any of you are on Instagram, I'm sure a lot of you are, then we all participated, or we perform a certain specific identity for that. That is something that we are very much trained to do nowadays, all of us.
Which is the subject of our talk next week with Shimon Basar. Which is basically, yeah, how do we, like, we are driven to like create these identities that we kind of produce and reproduce, and are also being reproduced and kind of informed by all these
thank you, Jude.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
All right. I see. Okay. I mean, I know it's very late for you already in Hong Kong. It's very
okay.
I think, I don't know, I don't see there are more questions, but I'm sure there might be some questions later in the closed meetings that we will have with the group. So I would relay some questions to you maybe in the future, WhatsApp or something. No, but that was really amazing, really. And I have so many questions or so many things that I want to also talk to you about. Maybe I just ask this one last question before we say goodbye to you. Like, how do you negotiate? There's a lot of like interesting materials related to the image of, you know, whatever that you're doing, especially when it's collaborative work, or, you know, so there's like always this visual aspect, which that is being invented or created or endorsed or informed, whatever, by the process, all of that. How do you negotiate all of this, like these aesthetics with, because this is also part of the visual, you know, how, like, you know, communicate this also to others, particularly when this is moving, when you are also inserting it in an exhibition and you're not there, or you have it on your website, or how is there, like, what is this process of yeah, finding your visuals? Or as you say, like you said, you spoke very brilliantly about the sound cloud project, which I find fascinating. Or what about all these beautiful graphics that you have also?
Well, I mean, that's again maybe like where collaboration comes into play, like those aesthetics for each. I mean, if going from one project to another, it's hard to, I don't know how to show it to you actually, but they're very, very different from one project to another. And those things are always going to be the confluence of the people that you're working with in that particular instance.
We do not see your, we do not see your screen, but I wasn't referring to a particular project really. I mean, altogether.
But that's what I'm saying is that like I can't. It's hard because those things are the confluence of those particular contexts and people, different people that I'm working with in the different instances. Like you mentioned the ... propaganda department. And that is also, I would say, a very, very different aesthetic. And that comes out of, you know, the different mutual desires and styles, you could say, or aesthetics and the ideas. I mean, it's a tricky question. I mean, I don't think that artists, it's not necessarily our place actually as artists to be able to vocalize so eloquently like the actual aesthetics of our practice, because I believe very much sort of in a sort of like embodiment as I talk about this relationship between theory and practice. Like the artist is not actually necessarily always so aware of how things come out of them, you know. And it actually bothers me very much nowadays how there's such a hierarchy of language and being able to eloquently theorize your work as a prerequisite for your, you know, the measure of success you have in the art world. And this is really only in the past 20 years that it's been this way. But if you think back to, you know, artists from the 50s and 60s, it was not about that at all, right? It's not about how you theorize your work. And of course, it's not that we shouldn't talk about our work, but I think it's not. It takes also the viewer of the work to complete the work, I think, and therefore that idea of, because every viewer will also see something different in every work, and so what it is in the end is really very, very hard for me to then like reduce to one particular thing. I don't know if that's how you mean in terms of like how do those aesthetics come about?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of these like there are several possibilities to an answer, and this is like one of the intelligent answers, as we really understand here.
I mean, this is my. Oh, sorry.
Tell us. I mean.
Oh no, I just wanted to because this was something also that I think relates. Like, this is my personal website, and this front page of this website is actually just a list of names. And for me, I mean, it's an interesting like irony in a way, because putting the name sometimes feels a little bit, oh, you're name dropping different people, but of course there's more non-famous people on here. But for me, like basically the determination is that anybody who's listed in any of the works that are inside the website, some of them are collaborators, some of them are actually were people who inspired the work, some of them were people who commissioned the work, some of the people were subjects of the work, but that like juxtaposition, this becomes a cloud, like a personal cloud of all of these relations. For me, is also like a sideways way of talking about that production. Is like their influences, they're everything. They're the people who made it come together, and they're the people that I collaborate with. And are we a commons? Are we something? I'm not sure, but that does not mean those possibilities and those connections are not there and cannot be made, you know. And this is somehow the reason why this is done in this way. So that aesthetic of this becoming like an email, if we want to use this as an example of like how the aesthetic arrives from this thought, is it's designed like an email, right? And email, I come from that era, you know, where email is something I still value very much. I think a lot of people do not use email so often anymore, but I really love email because there's something you know, it still relates to this epistolary form of like writing letters and a one-to-one conversation that the internet does differently, of course. And so this is a mass of people, but it's about the one-to-one.
Totally, yeah. Thank you very, very much. It was really amazing. And yeah, thank you very much again. And sorry for keeping you late also, like probably it's 1:30 or something now at your end or even more. But we stay in touch. Good luck and best of luck with the opening tomorrow. I hope it all goes well with
well, I'm not in Guangzhou, so I cannot say. I hope they are doing okay, and that the works won't be destroyed too much. But
yes. They won't be destroyed at all. And there are some nice comments in the chat if you want to have a look before we close up.
Yes, I thank you all very much for your patience. And yeah, if there are any questions at all about anything or you want to know more, please feel free to contact me. You can get my information from Allah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.